there are stories we think we know completely. Rome, the eternal city, the Republic, the Empire. We've heard of Caesar, of gladiators, of aqueducts stretching across the countryside like stone veins. But beneath the well-worn tales lies something else entirely. Tonight, I'd like to take you beyond the history books to the Rome that existed in the quiet spaces between the famous moments. The Rome that archaeologists find in forgotten corners. The Rome that ancient writers mentioned only in passing, as if it were too ordinary to warrant much attention. Yet it is precisely in these overlooked details that we find the most remarkable truths. What I'd like to share with you this evening are not the grand narratives, but rather the subtle revelations, the kind that change how we understand everything that follows. Before we begin, I should mention that this presentation has been created with the assistance of artificial intelligence technology. It is intended purely for educational purposes, to explore, to question, and to remember together. Now, let us turn our attention to ancient Rome. Around 800 BCE, the 7 hills of Rome were occupied by scattered villages. These were not Romans yet. They were Latins, living in simple huts with thatched roofs, keeping pigs and growing grain. Archaeological evidence shows they cremated their dead and placed the ashes in urns shaped like the huts they'd lived in. This detail is worth pausing over. These people imagined that death was simply another kind of dwelling, that the shape of home mattered even in the afterlife. It tells us something about how they saw the world, practical, intimate, and deeply concerned with continuity. But here is where the story becomes more complex. Just across the Tiber River lived the Etruscans. A civilization far more advanced, with written language, sophisticated metalwork, and cities that would have seemed almost impossibly grand to the Latin villagers. According to records and archaeological layers, around 600 BCE, Etruscan kings began to rule Rome. This is the part that often goes unmentioned in popular histories. Rome did not begin as Rome. It began as an Etruscan outpost. A colonized territory, governed by foreign kings who brought with them architectural knowledge, religious practices, and political structures that the Latins had never conceived of before. The very word person comes from the Etruscan fursu, a masked figure in religious ceremonies. Even the Roman alphabet was adapted from Etruscan script. This raises an important question: when did Rome actually become Roman? The traditional date given for the founding of the Roman Republic is 509 BCE. The year the last Etruscan king, Tarquin the Proud, was supposedly expelled after his son assaulted a noblewoman named Lucretia. But historians generally agree that this story, while dramatic, obscures a more gradual process. What likely happened was not a single revolution but a slow transfer of power from Etruscan aristocrats to Latin families who had grown wealthy through trade and agriculture. The archaeological record shows no sudden break, no burned palaces, no mass graves. Instead, we see continuity. The same temples continued to be maintained. The same religious festivals continued to be observed. But the language of official inscriptions gradually shifted from Etruscan to Latin. Over time, small details began to emerge that didn't quite align with the heroic narrative. For instance, we know from ancient census records, stone tablets discovered in the 20th century, that voting rights in early Rome were restricted to those who could afford military equipment. This wasn't democracy as we understand it. It was a system in which wealth determined political power. Yet this same system produced something unexpected, a culture that prized civic duty, public debate, and most remarkably, the idea that laws should apply equally to patrician and plebeian alike, at least in theory. Here we find a paradox worth considering. Rome was oligarchic, militaristic, and often brutal. But it was also governed by written law, public discourse, and institutions designed to prevent any single individual from accumulating too much power. For nearly 5 centuries, this system held. Until it didn't. So far, we've seen how Rome emerged from Etruscan influence and developed its republican institutions, imperfect, yes, but remarkably stable for their time. What I'd like to explore next is perhaps more surprising. How ordinary Romans actually lived, and how different their daily existence was from what we typically imagine. This is where the untold history becomes most vivid. When we think of Roman architecture, we picture the Colosseum, the Pantheon, temples with soaring columns. But most Romans never set foot in such buildings except as spectators. According to research conducted on the residential districts of Rome, particularly excavations at Ostia, Rome's port city, which preserved entire neighborhoods, we now know that the vast majority of Romans lived in multi-story apartment buildings called insulae. These were not luxurious. They were often poorly constructed, prone to collapse, and extremely vulnerable to fire. The ground floors might house shops or taverns. Upper floors were reached by narrow staircases and consisted of cramped rooms with no running water, no heating except portable braziers, and no sanitation beyond chamber pots that were emptied into the streets below. Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century CE, complained frequently about the noise, the smell, and the danger of walking beneath these buildings at night, not from crime alone, but from the very real possibility that someone might empty a chamber pot without warning from an upper window. Yet within this crowded, chaotic urban landscape, something remarkable was happening. Rome had become the first true metropolis. A city of over 1 million inhabitants, drawing people from every corner of the known world. There were Syrians and Egyptians, Greeks and Gauls, Africans and Iberians. The street graffiti preserved in Pompeii and Rome itself shows us a multilingual, multicultural society, far more diverse than we typically imagine. And here is a detail that I find particularly striking. Many of you enjoy continuing the research on your own, and I've noticed this surprises people. Roughly 1/3 of Rome's population were slaves. Yet Roman slavery was not based on race or ethnicity. A person could be enslaved through war, debt, or birth, but also freed through manumission, sometimes purchasing their own freedom, sometimes granted it by their masters. Freed slaves could become citizens. Their children could hold public office. The Emperor Pertinax, who ruled briefly in 193 CE, was the son of a freed slave. This does not excuse the institution. Slavery was brutal, dehumanizing, and central to Rome's economy. But it functioned differently than later systems of slavery, and understanding this difference helps us see why Roman society was so fluid, so constantly in motion. It was a world where status was always being negotiated. Which brings us, inevitably, to the question that has occupied historians for over 1500 years: why did Rome fall? There are 2 explanations historians offer. One is widely accepted. The other is rarely discussed, though it may be more accurate. The traditional explanation points to external pressures: Germanic tribes crossing the Rhine and Danube, Huns pushing westward from Central Asia, economic strain from defending impossibly long borders. This version emphasizes the year 476 CE, when the last Western Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by a Germanic chieftain named Odoacer. This narrative has the virtue of drama, a clear beginning, middle, and end. Barbarians at the gates. The eternal city sacked. Darkness descending across Europe. But the archaeological evidence tells a different story. Let me first explore the traditional view more fully, because it contains important truths. By the 3rd century CE, Rome's military was stretched dangerously thin. Legions that had once been composed primarily of Roman citizens were now largely recruited from the very peoples Rome had conquered: Germans, Dacians, Sarmatians. These soldiers were loyal to their generals, not to Rome itself. The economy was faltering. Debasement of currency led to inflation. Trade routes became unsafe. Cities shrank. Literacy declined. The very idea of a unified Mediterranean world began to fragment. All of this is documented. All of this is real. But here's what that narrative overlooks. The Eastern Roman Empire, what we call Byzantium, continued for another 1,000 years. Constantinople, founded by Constantine in 330 CE, remained the largest, wealthiest, most sophisticated city in Christendom until 1453, when it finally fell to the Ottoman Turks. The legal code compiled under Emperor Justinian in the 6th century became the foundation for European law. Greek remained the language of learning. Roman architectural techniques, administrative systems, and military tactics all survived. So the question becomes more subtle: Rome didn't fall. It transformed. In the West, Roman institutions merged with Germanic ones. Latin evolved into French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, Romanian. The Catholic Church preserved Latin learning and Roman administrative structures. Medieval kings claimed to be heirs of Rome. This is the second explanation, the one less often discussed. Rome didn't collapse. It dispersed. It became something else. Perhaps the real story is not about endings at all, but about how civilizations adapt, absorb, and continue in forms their founders would never recognize. What the documents reveal is not dramatic, but it is profound. In 2019, a team of archaeologists working near the Roman Forum discovered a layer of soil dated to approximately 540 CE, decades after the traditional fall of Rome. Chemical analysis of this soil showed something unexpected: evidence of continued urban agriculture, olive oil production, and organized waste management. People were still living there. Still farming. Still maintaining some semblance of civic order. Similar findings have emerged from other Italian sites, from North Africa, from Gaul. The transition from ancient to medieval was not a sudden catastrophe but a gradual shift, sometimes taking centuries, varying widely by region. In some places, aqueducts continued to function into the 9th century. In others, they fell into disrepair within decades. What this tells us is that history is not a single narrative but thousands of local stories, each with its own pace, its own logic, its own outcome. Rome fell many times, in many different ways, depending on where you stood and when you were standing there. And perhaps that's the most important lesson. The past is not a monument. It's a conversation, one that changes as we ask different questions, examine different evidence, and listen to voices that were previously silent. We began this evening by asking about the untold history of Rome, the stories beneath the familiar narratives. What we found is not a single hidden truth but a mosaic of small revelations. Etruscan origins. Multicultural streets. Gradual transformations rather than sudden collapses. Perhaps the lesson here isn't about Rome at all. It's about how easily important things can slip from memory if no one takes the time to remember them. How the grand narratives we tell ourselves often obscure quieter, more complex realities. How every civilization is built on foundations it doesn't always acknowledge. Rome thought of itself as eternal, urbs aeterna, the eternal city. And in a sense, it was right. Not because it never changed, but because it changed so thoroughly that pieces of it exist everywhere we look, in our laws, our languages, our architecture, our very ideas about citizenship and public life. The Romans are gone. But Rome remains, not as it was, but as it became. Which suggests that perhaps nothing truly ends. It only transforms into something we don't yet recognize as continuous with what came before. That strikes me as worth pondering. If you enjoy quiet explorations like this, stories that reward patience and careful attention, you're welcome to subscribe. I try to post 1 or 2 of these each week. I'd be interested to know how you interpret what we've discussed tonight. Many of you have shared thoughtful perspectives in past comments, and I find those conversations often deepen my own understanding. Feel free to share your thoughts below, or simply to sit with these ideas for a while. Either way, thank you for spending this time together. Until next time.